Hi, I'm Allison Powell, and I'm an AP Government teacher. And tonight we're going to talk about iron triangles and issue networks and how to apply them using current examples. And we'll also look at some FRQs. You can follow us on Twitter or Instagram at ThinkFiveable, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. So again, tonight we're going to define iron triangle and issue network. We're going to apply these terms, and we'll be looking at two different FRQs and some of the responses to those FRQs to see if they did or did not receive credit. Then we'll edit an FRQ, kind of tweak it a bit so that way it would earn full credit. So love to have you practice with me tonight. Okay. Just so you know, this is a standard that will be tested on the exam even in 2020. So you guys probably know about the different changes, but if you don't, let me tell you, the first 3 units will be tested on the AP exam this year. They have dropped units 4 and 5, but this really is a part of the bureaucracy, which is one of the governmental institutions that you learned about in Unit 2. So under the essential knowledge for the bureaucracy, it says that you should know about issue networks and iron triangles. So this will be tested on the 2020 exam and going forward after that. So first I want to just define iron triangle and issue network. So an iron triangle is a mutually beneficial relationship among Congress. Generally here, though, we're talking about congressional subcommittees, interest groups, and bureaucratic agencies. So Dwight Eisenhower, at the end of his administration, he gave an address that generally is a speech known to be a speech about the military-industrial complex. I think it's a really good example of an iron triangle. Basically, he's warning America, saying that prior to World War II, we hadn't really had a huge military. But with World War II, we had a giant military that continued to exist after the big war was over. And he's kind of warning about that. He says, in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. So there he's saying, hey, there is this military-industrial complex that will influence our public policy for good or for ill, and we need to be aware of its existence. So this is an example. That military-industrial complex is kind of an example of one iron triangle. So of the 3 sides of the triangle, you have congressional armed service committees and subcommittees, the Department of Defense, and then really weapons of war manufacturers, not just guns, but tanks and aircraft manufacturers. So what we'll talk about a little bit later, after we just define an iron triangle as this mutually beneficial arrangement among these 3 parties, is how they kind of feed off of one another. An issue network is a little bit more informal, but some say that an iron triangle is just one type of issue network. And you'll see on the AP exam questions in the past, they'll say, discuss an iron triangle or an issue network. So they're somewhat used interchangeably. However, generally when we think of an issue network, we think of this as a term that kind of came after the iron triangle. An idea that's kind of tweaked the iron triangle, if you will. So it just says that there's these groups of interested actors, interest groups, lobbyists, policy specialists, either in Congress, congressional staffers who are interested in a particular policy, or members of the bureaucratic agency, which are policy specialists. Grassroots organizations, think tanks, mass media, heck, everybody in the Twitterverse can jump onto an issue and be a part of an issue network. So this is more of a loose grouping instead of a tight, immutable iron triangle. You've got a lot more actors. And this probably shows a more realistic picture of how public policy is made, because a lot of times there's not just one government agency. For example, with education funding, you have education funding at the federal level, with the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Department of Education. Then you have the 50 state departments of education. Then you have local school boards, okay? But not only those groups, you have the NEA, the National Educators Association, which is a lobbying group on behalf of teachers, the ATF, the American Federation of Teachers. Those two groups lobby all three of these governmental entities. You have local and national parent-teacher organizations. You have textbook makers and test makers like the College Board. You also then have congressional education committees as well. So lots of different interested parties. Generally, we say that one difference between an iron triangle and an issue network, besides the fact that there's more than just three actors and that they have competing and overlapping interest, is that generally they disband after a policy resolution. So, after a policy has been decided, they're not going to be around. It's kind of because it's a loose grouping of these interested parties. Okay, but some textbooks still describe an iron triangle as like a type of issue network, and it is in that all three of the sides of the iron triangle are discussing one particular issue and kind of feed off of one another. Okay, so I want to look at this question here from 2013. It says, explain the importance of each of the following in implementation of public policy: bureaucratic discretion, issue networks, or iron triangles. So my question to you guys is, did this student earn the point of explaining bureaucratic discretion and iron triangles or issue networks? So the student says, executive agencies have discretion in how they want to implement public policy. This gives them a great deal of power in the implementation of public policy. However, Congress does have oversight over these agencies to keep a check on them. Iron triangles are made up of interest groups, executive agencies, and congressional committees. They work together to design the best legislation possible that suits all three sides. So here they tell you what an iron triangle is and that they kind of work together. So what do you guys think? Did the student earn the point? So I'm looking for a response in the chat box. So just a yay or nay, do you think the student earned the point for explaining the importance of an issue network or iron triangle or on bureaucratic discretion? So I think that if the student, or if the question had said, define bureaucratic discretion or define issue networks or iron triangles, then the student would have been fine. Basically, the student tells you what I told you about what an iron triangle is, that it's a mutually beneficial arrangement between those three groups of actors on a particular issue. However, that's not really explaining the importance, okay? And when Katie says that there's some misinformation, I think that the misinformation comes by not explaining it thoroughly. So let's talk about how we would explain iron triangles instead of just defining them, okay? Oh, also, I want to point out And this is straight from the College Board website on how to do FRQs for AP Government. The difference between defining, which I believe that student did, and explaining. So if you're to explain, you need to provide information about how or why a relationship, process, pattern, position, situation, or outcome occurs. So we were supposed to explain here the how or the why of that relationship between those three actors in the iron triangle. Okay, explain how typically requires analyzing the relationship, process, pattern, position, situation, or outcome, whereas explain why typically requires analysis of motivations or reasons for the relationship, process, pattern, position, situation, or outcome. So really, you just have to go into a little bit more detail. Okay, great. So let's move away from simply saying that there's a beneficial relationship among these three groups to talk about how this relationship exists and how they kind of feed off of one another. So with this graphic, you can see I'm going to look at the interest group side, because that's what you normally talk about a lot in AP Gov, I think, is how interest groups affect Congress. So when it says they provide electoral support, can anybody tell me what that means? How do interest groups provide electoral support to Congress? What does that mean exactly? Okay, good. So two ways, great. One, they donate to their campaigns, good. And also they can tell all their members to vote for them. They can rally their base of support, the interest group's base of support for Congress. I'm an educator and a member of the NEA, and my local chapter would always endorse particular members of Congress, or if it was a challenger, recommend the challenger. And, that carries a lot of weight with members. So yes, they can donate to their congressional campaigns, which is what we talk about a lot, but they can also rally all of their members to support a particular member of Congress. They even have like rating guides. You see this a lot with even like the NRA. They'll give, a particular congressperson an A or an F on a particular issue to help guide their members in who to vote for. So what does the interest group get from Congress for this electoral support? Well, they get friendly legislation, hopefully, and easier oversight on the policies that they're regulating, okay? One more thing I wanted to talk about here that they kind of feed off of one another is that interest groups get access to Congress generally through donations or from like parties. Of course, they don't do this as much anymore, but I used to be an intern at the state capitol in Tennessee, and we would go to these dinners. Well, if you're a lobbyist, you gave the dinner. I mean, you bought the dinner, and all the people on the committee, all the state House or Senate members on that committee would go to the dinner. They'd get their free dinner, and then the lobbyist would like give a talk. And so they weren't buying a vote, but they were more like buying access to give information. And so sometimes what interest groups provide Congress is information. And with that access, the interest group kind of gets to dictate the terms of the information. They get to be the purveyor of the information, which can be good for both parties. Hopefully that information is factually accurate for the good of the whole, right? For the good of the public. So in return for electoral support, they can get friendly legislation passed, the interest group can. how Congress works with the bureaucracy. So where it says Congress gives funding to the bureaucracy, what that means is, they have the power of the purse, right? Congress does. And so within the budget, they can put how much they want to spend on each bureaucratic agency. And, the bigger the budget for a particular agency, the more they can hire, the more pet projects they can take on. And so bureaucrats like when their budgets grow. And also just political support for the actions that the bureaucrats take. So what does Congress get in return? Well, bureaucrats get to basically write policy. They don't make the law, but in carrying out the law, they have a lot of discretion. So one of the terms in that FRQ was to explain discretion. Well, how I like to explain it to my students is, well, you know what I mean when I say I have some discretion over your grade. It means like, if you were at a 92.3 and you were a good student and really that's a B in my class, I might bump it up to a 93. Yeah, if you were at like a 92.3 or 92.4, you're just like a couple tenths a point away, right? So if I use my discretion, bump you up to an A, I'm using my authority to make decisions, which the bureaucracy has quite a bit of, because Congress can't write into law everything that it takes to flesh out a policy. So the bureaucracy does that. Well, if the bureaucracy isn't being supported by Congress much, then the laws that Congress passes might be flimsily executed by the bureaucracy. They might not really, or they could just kind of not do what Congress wants them to do, within certain parameters. So what does the bureaucracy give interest groups and vice versa? Well, the interest group can give congressional support to the bureaucracy, which they need through lobbying. Interest groups don't really lobby the bureaucracy directly. However, there is something called notice and comment. So when the bureaucracy puts forth a rule, then interest groups can weigh in on that particular rule. Okay, and so they can try to influence the bureaucracy that way. In return, the interest group for that congressional support can lower regulations on a particular interest group, give them special favors like a contract, and that can get kind of shady, but those are the deals that could be made. All right, so this is the iron triangle. If you are asked to explain the iron triangle, you need to talk about how each of these three actors get and give, okay? You can't just talk about them and vaguely or briefly, and just to say that the iron triangle exists and it's a mutually advantageous relationship among these three actors is just not going to do it for the explain point. So I have some current examples. We've just talked about military and education being an iron triangle or a issue network. I want to talk about gun control, tobacco, pharmaceutical sales, financial institutions, and COVID-19 response, because all of these have like an iron triangle. Every big issue, especially if there's money involved, especially if it's an industry, is going to have like an iron triangle or an issue network. So what I want you to do in the chat box is take one of those examples and kind of give me some interested parties. You don't have to have the full fleshed out, every part of the iron triangle, but what are some of the different parties from gun control down? Yeah, good. So gun control, the Judiciary Committee would be the congressional part of the triangle. The NRA and gun owners would be the interest groups, and then the department, the ATF, because the ATF, which is a subsection of the Department of Justice, so alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. They are the ones that regulate, gun laws, or they look at, they enforce gun laws, so registration, sales of guns, that thing. Okay. So COVID-19 response, they regulate products, that the healthcare professionals use. Okay, good. The president is the executive head and is crisis manager. Good, too. What have you guys heard in the news about things that have gone into the stimulus package? Anybody heard any specific things? Okay, so Congress, to mitigate the effects of the really bad recession that's going to hit, has put forth an act to alleviate some of the problems that are going to result. So unemployment insurance, regulations regarding that is going to change. Stimulus checks for everybody who qualifies, good. Okay, so those are all interested parties, but that's kind of not interest groups, because it's kind of a wider group of people. I mean, it's basically the whole American public except for the upper classes. Okay, have you heard about how the banks are really trying to get some of the stimulus money, because people are going to be defaulting on their mortgages, and so banks need to still be around, and so they want part of that stimulus money, and so do other big businesses, because they know that there's a possibility that they will fail because of the recessionary economy. Okay. So here are just some of the things that I thought of. We've already talked about gun control. So tobacco, big tobacco used to be a huge lobbying group. I mean, they've made movies about it. So big tobacco companies, the FDA, so that is the Department of Agriculture, and then agricultural subcommittees. They all three work kind of in tandem. Pharmaceutical companies lobby congressional health and human services committees, and then the FDA is kind of in charge, or that is the regulatory body that oversees them. In the last recession, several banks failed due to their policies and also some lending practices, right? And so since banks were considered too big to fail and Congress had to bail them out, they put forth the Dodd-Frank Act to regulate those banks. And it strengthened it strengthened the FDIC, a part of the FDIC, to regulate them more heavily. And so banks obviously did not like those regulations. And we've had a repeal with Donald Trump and his Congress, the Republican Congress at the time. It's still half Republican, right, in the Senate. But anyhow, they took those regulations off the books because they were lobbied by banks, saying that it was just a cumbersome regulation that stifled their growth. Okay. So with the COVID-19 response, you have lenders speaking out, renters speaking out, landlords who want to still get paid, even though their renters aren't going to be able to probably afford their rent. Gig economy workers, student loan payments have changed. So we've got lots of different interested parties with COVID-19 and how the government should respond to it. Okay, so I want to read this FRQ. So this response is to the same question that we had before. on that 2013 exam, which asked the student to explain one, bureaucratic discretion, and two, iron triangles. So explain the impact of those. So let's read this and see if it passed. Okay, they're point muster. Okay. Bureaucratic discretion allows for bureaucratic leaders to enact laws in ways they seem fit. This gives them a good amount of power, which is called discretionary authority. The bureaucratic leaders can interpret laws passed by Congress with a good amount of leniency, which changes the implementation of public policy. Iron triangles are the organizations of Congress, interest groups, and the bureaucracy. Each corner of the triangle has power, but a balance is kept. Interest groups keep Congress members in office with campaigning and funding. The Congress members keep the bureaucracy funded with public policy. The connection between these three groups keep the federal government from implementing certain public policy that would hurt the interest group, give the bureaucracy too much discretionary authority, or stop funding for federal organizations and the bureaucracy. Okay, so what do you think, guys? Did this student get the response or get the points for their response? What do you think? So just a yay or a nay. Do you think they earned the points? Okay, yeah. So this person did not give an example, which sometimes is a good thing to do, is to give an example. This person did not give an example. However, they explained it pretty well. They talked about what each, kind of vaguely, but they talked about what each person gives and what each person gets. Okay. So they earn the point. All right. A different FRQ, 2012. I want to read this one. It's very similar. Just explain how interest groups can use each of the following. And one of them is issue networks, also known as iron triangles. So I want to talk about whether or not this got the point. Interest groups also inform the public and congressmen's constituents on issues and who to vote for. Issue networks or iron triangles are made up of interest groups, congressional committees, and the bureaucracy. The interest groups form an alliance with the other two sides of the triangle, which influence Congress and leads to legislation proposed and passed in the interest group's favor. An example of iron triangles is a Committee on Aging in Congress, the AARP, and Social Security beneficiaries working to pass legislation raising Social Security benefit. Tricked you guys. You would you would think that this person got the point, okay, because they gave an example. However, this person did not. So what I want us to do in a minute with the Google Doc that I shared with you at the beginning is kind of edit this, and let's also talk about why they didn't get the point, okay? What's interesting here is this was the exemplary. This was the model given as the best answer or like a good answer from College Board on this question. But it did not get this 1 point that we're talking about iron triangles. I guess this is, I think on this question, this was the hardest one for kids to get. So this FRQ, if you read the whole thing, only got a 5 out of 6. Okay, so let's look at what was wrong with it. Okay, give me just 1 second. So what's wrong with this is, first of all, one thing is kind of inaccurate. All right. So I want to go through the whole thing and talk about how we could have done it better, and we'll put that into the FRQ that we type up. But interest groups also inform the public and congressmen's constituents on issues and who to vote for. Issue networks or iron triangles are made up of interest groups, congressional committees, and the bureaucracy. Correct. The interest group forms an alliance with the other two sides of the triangle, which influence Congress and leads to legislation being proposed and passed in the interest group's favor. Okay? An example that they give of an iron triangle is a Committee on Aging in Congress, correct. The AARP, correct. And then they say, and Social Security beneficiaries. That's different than the Social Security Administration. The beneficiary is actually the person receiving the benefit. So like your grandma who's on Social Security, it's not the Social Security agency. Okay, or administration that actually is the bureaucratic agency. So I think that is part of the problem, but it says it does not indicate how the AARP provides resources to the committee or how the committee provides favorable outcomes for the AARP and does not earn the point. Okay, so it's not saying, so here it says they influence Congress and they get legislation, but it doesn't really say how Congress is benefited. So you really need to talk about both sides of the triangle. So it says, should we go to the suggestion mode? Yeah, sure. I think I put that you guys could edit. Give me 1 second to exit this, and so that way I can share the other document. Okay, so a couple of you are in, great. So suggestion mode, I mean, I know how to do comments. If you guys want to do comments, and then we can I could type in the things that work, okay? So I went ahead and typed up what the person has, okay? Interest group forms an alliance with the other two sides of the triangle, which influence Congress and leads to legislation being proposed, okay, in the interest group's favor. So before we do that, I think she had written something about, let me go back to it, what an iron triangle is, which is important. So I'd first, if I were to sketch this out, and I would definitely sketch it out before, I would define an iron triangle. Then I would talk about the relationships. Discuss relationships. How each gives and gets. Then, if you know and you are sure of your example, then I would use the example. So someone asked me, should you put in kind of information that, oh, what did you say? Let me go back and look. So the question is, give more details even when it's not related directly to the question. Okay, so if it's not related to the question, then definitely don't put it in, especially this time because you're only going to have 45 minutes. So, you know, you need to work pretty expeditiously. However, an example is not necessarily, especially if it's on an explain point. If it's on a describe or especially a define point, don't put an example in. But if it's an explain point, they really are looking for a little bit more depth. So it's good to use an example, but you don't always have to, as long as you've pretty thoroughly explained the relationships. Okay. So if you say something that's wrong, you're not necessarily going to have points taken off. It kind of just depends. So if you know of an example, for example, like the military-industrial complex is big. I mean, you probably heard a lecture on on that, I'd say, and I kind of reviewed it. So that's something that you could use, that relationship between the Department of Defense, military weapons manufacturers, and congressional armed services committees in both the House and Senate. That's definitely a strong relationship. So if you can remember things like that, then I would definitely use an example. Okay, but you don't have to earn the point, and you should not if you don't have time. Okay, so let's go back to that Google Doc. So what do you guys think? Do you want to just turn on, do you want to put it in comments? So if one of you will define an iron triangle, I got a hand. So I'll go back to the chat box. If someone can define an iron triangle, and then this example I'll work on. So I'll work on making the example a little bit better. If someone could define the iron triangle, and then maybe someone else, or there's two others, work on discussing the relationship, how each gives and gets. And I can work on it with you in just a minute. I'm going to go back to the chat box and see who wants to do what. So in the chat box, okay, if somebody will claim defining an iron triangle, okay, cool, thank you, Katie. And if someone else will work on the relationship between the iron triangle and, the Congress and the interest group. And then I can work on the bureaucracy, because that's usually the toughest part for kids to write about. Okay, so we have no idea how many FRQs they're going to put out until April 3rd. And on April 3rd, we will know how many FRQs there will be. And so you'll know a little bit more about timing. Okay. I think, it's not going to be 65 FRQs, but it's probably going to be more than 4, and I would say shorter FRQs. Okay, but we'll know more on April 3rd. Is the iron triangle the same as a linkage institution? Yes, in that your linkage institutions are the mass media and interest groups and political parties. Those are your linkage institutions. Those link, when we say linkage institutions, we're talking about linking the people to the government, okay? And so interest groups are a type of linkage institution. And so that kind of goes with iron triangles, in that the iron triangle, the interest group part, is linking the bureaucracy to, the interest group represents the people, and then they are kind of linking the people to the government. Okay. The reason why I put informal in there is because it's not like a system that is like established in place. It just kind of explains a relationship that has kind of organically came about. So I just changed that to put an iron triangle is an informal system in the government that works together with interest groups. How about to kind of use that term from the linkage institution, that links interest groups, bureaucracy, and Congress. What do you think about that, James? Many believe that this helps citizens have a say in the government, which is true, because they're having a say through that interest group, as well as working together with government officials, congressmen. Good. This brings support to certain interest groups, which fuel and help many ideas that are prominent in Congress. Congressmen use this information to make bills and eventually laws. The bureaucracy enforces these laws. Okay, so this kind of gets at what someone else is typing. Good. let me talk about the bureaucracy before I talk about the example. Enforces these laws that are maybe say something and is funded by Congress. We pretty much said that. And then we say down here, interest groups can either donate to members of Congress, can donate to the opponent campaign, and can also lobby members to vote for its preferred legislation. I'm going to move this up here. Okay, good. That is a good point about the bureaucracy. You could put it probably over here. However, we are getting a bit long on this, and I think it's just because we have the time, and you don't normally have that time on the exam. So I think that this is a well fleshed out essay that we're creating here. It's just the bare bones. I don't think that you would have the time to write this kind of thing. Make sure that you answer the question and that you adequately explain a relationship, okay? And if you can, give me an example would be great. But if you can't, or if you don't know one, then I would not give an example. As long as you talk about the relationships and what each is getting and what each is giving, it is good, okay? Okay. So it's kind of hard to tie all this in together because we're kind of working as a group. Group FRQs can be good, but they can also be hard to kind of organize. But I definitely think that we have something here in that we have a definition, then a relationship talking about what each gets and gives, and then also an example that I tweaked from the student in the sample response. So I have one more question here. I'm going to answer that after I end the live feed. But thanks so much for joining and thanks for participating. It really goes so much better when you guys participate. And I think you learn a lot more too. So again, thanks. And if you have the ability, buy that cram pass for AP Gov. Robbie May is a great teacher, and I know that you'll love his lessons. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope you have a great night.